Exploring the power of curiosity with today's leaders. Uncloud Your Curiosity with Schellman's Chief Executive Officer, Avani Desai.
Hello, I'm Avani Desai, CEO of Schellman. Welcome to another episode of Uncloud Your Curiosity. I'm excited today to have Milan Patel, SVP of SaaS Compliance at Oracle. We're going to be talking about how you use curiosity and innovation when working with auditors and your engineering teams. Welcome, Milan.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here.
Good to be here. So before we get started, I'm really excited to have you here because you're our first client on this episode, but also you have such an interesting background. So I was looking, you're in the Air Force, you're a special agent with the FBI, and then you went into engineering, and now you lead compliance. So tell me a little bit about your background and how your journey got to where you are today.
Sure, thanks. So it's really interesting because I never really understood even how I got here today. And I think a lot of it came from, as you work through your career, I was an engineer out of college, I did some technical program work, and as I kind of worked my way into the engineering teams, I found that certain skills that I've learned along the way in the military in terms of operational management, and then the Bureau in terms of how to, let's say, understand people and their motivations really helped me in the engineering world. And then compliance, as I worked through working a large $5 billion engineering project, I had to use these skills because I also managed compliance on the engineering side. And then what I found was that over the course of this time, people kind of considered compliance like being the Mike Rowe of engineering. It's the dirty job. And so I actually kind of liked it because the influence that you need to have as a compliance leader actually spans many teams. It spans engineering in terms of the development teams, the operations teams, and the security teams. So I've always been kind of drawn to these big challenges that span multiple projects at scale. So for me, it seemed like a natural fit, and I found I really liked it.
I love that. So let's talk about, this whole session is about curiosity, innovation. And when people think of engineering, they think of like bits and bytes, right? And your hands to keyboard. But your journey, where you've talked about, you went from engineering to compliance and it's more holistic, how do you feel that curiosity has allowed you to be successful? And how has it allowed you to manage the engineering teams when you're working with your auditors as well?
That's a great question. And I think the way I looked at it as the engineering, when you talk about hands-on keyboard, that's what they do. But the real way you work with engineering is you have to understand how they do it and what the impacts of that are. And then for my personal journey, and we'll talk about some of this today, I think, is around how you define success. Because from a compliance perspective, we'll talk more about the way that compliance has been done up to this point. It's been with the bat, right? Like they talk about compliance is overhead, compliance is painful. Well, that's because we make it that way, and we haven't really looked at what's important to the engineering team. And so when you kind of change that from a curiosity and wonder perspective, for me, I had to throw the rule book out. The rule book doesn't apply anymore as compliance continues to scale, and not only the number of frameworks we have to do, but the speed that we have to do that. So innovation and curiosity is the only way we're going to change the rule book. Because while we're transforming to the cloud, in my view, in many areas, compliance has not transformed its practices to be effective at scale in the cloud. So that's why I think you really have to focus on the engineering team, because they're the ones that get the work done at the end of the day.
So that's really interesting. So when you say, compliance was like a bat, right? I've heard people say it's a check the box exercise. It's something that's an afterthought. So how do you keep engineering teams excited about what you need from them, at the same time allow them to keep on learning?
So this is where you have to throw the rule book out on the metrics and the currency that they use. When you think about engineers, so for compliance, what is the currency we think about? Passing the audit, gathering evidence. But that doesn't align with engineers, because as being an engineer on a large project, my number one currency was time. And so if you want to keep engineers engaged, you have to change your metrics to show them that you're not wasting their time. Like, we can't give them time. And I'll tell you, all the engineering leaders, senior leaders I work with, they know that compliance is important. It's the number one trust vehicle for customers. It opens up new markets. So it's not that they don't want to do it, it's that they don't believe that compliance is a good steward of their time. And so by developing new metrics, thinking completely in a different way, you can show engineers, that if they work with us, we can save them that currency that they care about in order to put that towards other features for our customers.
Yeah.
And when you build that confidence and trust in not only how you as the compliance team work it, but with your auditors, that you're not wasting their time, then they want to get innovative because now they want to save even more time. So that's where I think the conversation changes. And what I call it is, you have to go into this as compliance as an engineering feature, not as an overhead function. Now, it's a feature because it opens new markets.
Yeah.
But the metrics, if you think about the ones that we use traditionally, don't align to that. And that's where the transformation has to happen. And at Oracle, and even working with Schellman, we've been able to have some of that movement forward in the alliance on getting engineers excited and innovative and curious about making change.
So I think you're one of the first people that I've talked to that's thinking in this way. And can you give me some real world examples of how you've had this transformation over the past several years?
Sure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the metrics, and then I'll tell you why it was important for engineering leaders. So thinking completely differently, and I mentioned it earlier about ensuring that we're not wasting engineering time. So I developed a metric, we've talked about this, called first time resolution.
Okay.
Now, that metric, I'll kind of walk through it because it's extremely important for a number of factors. So first time resolution is the first time we gather a piece of evidence from an engineer. They're the ones who provide it. I want a 95% confidence it's going to make it all the way through the system.
Yeah.
Makes it through my team QA, your line auditors, your QA team, and sign off. Because what does that do? That reduces the need to talk with the engineers during an audit. And that's one of the big misnomers, is that we have to partner better with engineers and innovate with engineers during an audit. That's the worst time to talk to engineers. They're in sprints. Yeah. So you have to rethink what are important to engineers. And it's predictability of ask, right?
Yeah.
They want to know that when they spend time giving you something, it's going to be good. So notice that metric is not a traditional compliance metric. And so I had to develop even tracking systems to be able to show where the breakdowns in that communication are. So it's a completely different, in my view, innovative way of giving engineers what they want, which is that confidence that you're not wasting their time. So if that metric is high, this is the impact of that metric. If you can show them on paper that you're not wasting their time, because when they give you evidence it makes it through, it builds trust. Not only in my team, the compliance team asking them for stuff, but with the auditors saying that we have a good partnership and we've really nailed the ask, right? It's a good ask, not ambiguous.
Sure.
You don't need to call them in the middle of an audit cycle to explain it. That builds confidence in the compliance program, but it also shows them that we're saving them engineering time.
Yeah.
Because every kickback to them is at least a half hour of work.
Oh yeah.
At least, and I use that term to be very conservative. Some are 10 minutes, some could be days and hours. So now I can show that if we reduce those kickbacks, I'm not only saving them time during the audit, but I'm saving them engineering hours that I can account for. And so engineering leaders look at that and say, wow, you've saved me time. And I can say now with trust, well, if you work with me in this area, it's like it takes you 3 days because you're pulling it from 6 different resources. Maybe we can automate this. Let's go automate it. So it builds that, what I call a shared goal that gets us both what we want, predictability and credibility for me in the audit, and it saves you time. But again, it comes with changing those metrics. So that was the most important metric.
So let me ask you one question. Do you feel that the relationship between engineering and compliance has completely changed since you put these metrics together? You gave them time back, you're valuing what they're going to bring to the table, because typically in an audit we see sometimes that friction, right? You're taking away from my day-to-day job. I have so many things to do. I got to get my sprints. I'm working on these agile development. But now you respect the time they have. You're giving them clear guidance on what they need, but your team is getting what they need. I mean, have you seen a relationship change?
Oh, absolutely. It manifests itself in a number of ways. At the senior leadership level, they don't question the amount of work it takes to do audits now, because I can show it. And I can show it's done efficiently at 95% accuracy or above, right? Because they know they have to do the work. That's never the question. It's usually that, well, you came back to me 4 times for the same evidence. Why did I have to explain it? So again, that erodes the trust. But now the other important thing is I don't have to justify the amount of work an audit takes. I can show them through the metrics how many pieces of evidence. I know how it's going to make it through. it's a very important metric for them on how to actually account for the engineering time it takes for the compliance feature. And on the engineering side, it's even more amazing. When you build that confidence and trust through the metrics, they are sending people to me now. They are assigning people full-time, the engineering team, on their own, to work with my team to find more efficiencies. And then once we have 95% accuracy, I can now automate it because I know it's good. And so they actually want to remove themselves from the system completely. And there are other long-term effects which you really don't even see. One of them is that now that we have that, I can have continuous compliance because I can write checks against that. And it just increases the entire level of auditing to the point where the engineering team actually reach out to do the work. So that's the real effect of that. And then from a cost perspective, these metrics now, if an audit firm is helping me set good goals where they're not randomizing my engineering time, I'm going to have more trust in them, and they're likely could see more business from me. Because again, I'm schedule driven with the way these audits keep growing. So the impacts of it have been amazing. Even this year, my manager was so excited to show our senior manager because this year alone, I can say, it's some rough numbers, saving millions of dollars of cost, but more importantly, I've given thousands of hours back to engineering teams where they can go write new features. And believe me, they were excited about doing more work in that space.
And those are metrics that a lot of people don't realize. Like, those are like the soft metrics that are really important to the engineering team.
Yeah, they're not soft anymore because I can actually track them. So that's the value of really, thinking with that curiosity you're talking about. How do we change the game in this where the engineers now really understand the value we can bring them?
So what advice would you give others in your seat? Because I don't think a lot of people are trying to think outside of the box of how do we make, our audits more efficient? How do we consolidate audits? You're right. There's a new framework every few months that comes in, right, about security or privacy. So if someone is sitting in your seat who's overwhelmed with the number of frameworks that they have, trying to get the auditors all the information they need, they're getting external pressure to keep costs down, what would you tell them? You've talked about metrics, you've talked about processes, you've talked about the good relationship that you have with engineering, but what are some tactical steps that they can take?
Well, the first thing I always tell them is you have to understand your customer, which in this case is the engineering, operations, or security team. And you really have to not only understand that time is important, you have to be able to dig in and understand where they're spending their time on your work. And that's something that compliance teams don't traditionally do. I would say a tactical thing is go to your engineering team and say, okay, when you go collect this evidence, walk me through exactly what you do. Because they don't realize, like when you're trying to talk about reducing that friction, it's an engineering action, they just go and do it. So sometimes what I say for people that want to work it at scale is you have to be able to, one, understand the data, which means you have to set up for success. So it's an operational issue, not a compliance issue. Like when you set up the metrics, you have to have the right data to do the metrics. So for us, I would say, how do you track that piece of evidence through every stage of approval? Because once you understand that, then you can track to see where it breaks down. So I always say the first thing is understand you have a business and operational problem, not a compliance problem. And I think that's the number one tactical thing I would tell people is you really have to go look at it from the business view that way. Because I'm going to say this kind of tongue in cheek, the compliance stuff is content. How you manage it can be the same for any other type of content. As a matter of fact, I'm using the same engineering operations view that I used when I was running an engineering team. But I changed the metrics and I changed what I track to go with the content. But the process is the same. And I think that's where people break down. Because if you don't throw out this idea of the bats, you will never innovate on how to do the interpersonal awareness piece to change behavior. And I think that's the biggest thing I would tell people is you gotta look at the behaviors first and not necessarily the content and throw out the bat because it just doesn't work anymore.
I agree. And it's definitely not one and done. We've talked about scaling of compliance. I'm sure Oracle is getting more complex. There's acquisitions that are going on. How do you continue to use curiosity to make this process better? And how often do you have to do it? I mean, is this something that you meet with your teams on a monthly basis, a quarterly basis? Like, how do you make sure you scale, but you also are agile and can change based on what the need is?
That's a great thing to talk about because the push and pull is really important. And I think for me, what I have to look at is short, medium, and long-term industry trends. The one thing we've talked about is this increase of trends with companies, or not just industry, but with governments, on how to deal with all of these changes, which are some ways kind of repackaging and tightening of different requirements, but you're not going to do audits for each one. So when I talk about meeting and talking through innovation, you really have to look at the problem and try to, what I call game theory, the problem that's coming for you. Sure. Like, where's the tidal wave coming from? And it's not an exact science, but I think for people like us that are in the industry, we can kind of see the trends coming. And then if you marry the trends with what you think your customers, which in my case is engineering on the internal side, then how do you map those two together, knowing what their challenges will be, which really is about the time it takes to go do this work. So when I talk about meeting, I probably, tactically, we have a lot more what we call wallow sessions, right? So they're pretty informal, but you have to start thinking about that in an informal way. And then what I do is I go, I'm a metrics guy. Okay, so if I have an idea, I come up with principles. These are the principles we want to follow. Like we want to eliminate the amount of touch points with engineers during an audit. That's a principle. Then you turn that into a metric, and then you have to pressure test the metric. So you prototype it, you see if you're getting the results, and then you iterate. But I think the curiosity piece comes in is that you have to completely think outside of the normal industry that you're in, because otherwise you get into that groupthink, right? And that's where and I believe that's where we've been with compliance, because while the industry has moved, we're starting to move how we think about that in the bigger business picture. Because I think in the end, it's all about dollars and cents on the bottom line. And if you can't show that value, that translation to that, the translation skills become extremely important if you want to be successful.
Sure. So while you've done this process, has there ever been times when maybe you made a mistake and engineering pushed back? And, what did you do to make sure that you stopped, looked back, did a post-mortem, and then rechanged it? Because people aren't going to get it right the first time, right? There's no playbook for what you're doing, which is really exciting. So how do you deal with change that maybe the engineering team didn't take to for the first time?
Sure, I've got a great example of that. So when I first organized, I decided to go with domains, right? Not with services. We'll talk about that. So I organized the team and worked by domains. And I figured, well, you get a domain expert, let's say security, like for identity management, right? All the controls. Then they'll be able to look across multiple services to say, hey, how does that work? And we could take a best practice from here and then use that in another service. But what I found is decentralizing that away from a service caused a lot of friction with the engineers, because now I have multiple people asking the engineers for the evidence on the same service. That did not go over well, right? Because again, it's more touch points. It kind of worked against my idea of less touch points. But I didn't know that. I had to go through the exercise, and it was painful for an audit or two where we were trying it out. And so I think the big thing is to be reflective and just admit that did not work. I said, mea culpa. It was bad. So then I realigned it back to service-oriented. So now I have people responsible for a full service, all domains. So they might know the service, but I'm not going to get that, let's say, cross-team pollination with, say, identity management, but I only have one touch point for the service. And I found that, having, I would say, the self-criticism to admit that not everything's going to work. And so I talked to the leaders. I went to them and said, I'm sorry, you're right. That didn't work. Let's try a different thing. You have to iterate and experiment. And I think that's a big part of it. But again, as you build trust and they started seeing results, they're more willing to take those chances with you to try it. And they weren't necessarily too upset. Yeah, some of the people were upset because they got pinged multiple times. But when you explain and they start seeing the other values and you tell them, look, we're getting that other value because you were willing to experiment. And so again, building that trust is what really allows you to try more things outside of the box. Because they understand that there is a risk of it not necessarily working. And then I explain it just like engineering. Hey, we prototype features all the time with customers. We don't do them all, right? Sometimes they don't work and they fail miserably. So again, it's about equating to engineering in the language that they understand that compliance as a feature sometimes has the same type of challenges that we have to try and fail with.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's really exciting to see how you took wonder and curiosity. You thought outside of the box to make a process which has been the same for years and years really work. And increase the time, decrease cost, and really increase efficiency. So congratulations to you. And I look forward to sharing this because I think this is definitely something that a lot of other organizations within the compliance space should do. So,
Well, appreciate it. And again, it's been a great relationship so far working with Schellman, and we look forward to future successes.
Awesome. Thanks, Milan.
Thank you.
A special thank you to Milan Patel. I really enjoyed how he has thought outside of the box of working with compliance, the auditors, and engineering teams. I hope you can join us next time with Matt Goodrich, Schellman's Head of Transformation.